came up with the Third Thursday Studios. And the idea behind this is that you can visit with an author or an artist or a symphony in a small, intimate setting. And obviously, this lovely building has turned out to be the perfect setting. We started talking about it. We wanted to have local artists come and share the evening with you. So we started talking among our committee, and it was amazing how many people they knew, which made it so much interesting. So tonight we're going to welcome our first candidate, our kickoff gentleman, who is one of our local authors, and he has some books in the back. I'm going to let Connie come up and introduce him a little bit more. I just want to say welcome to everybody, and to, let's see, make sure I got everybody here. Yes, we wanted to have Connie come up and tell you all about our first guest.
Thank you, Cindy. Well, as a member of the Third Studio Committee, I was asked to get an author for the first evening, and I had a small list of people that I was going to contact, but my good friend Becky Hawley said, there's somebody I'd like you to meet, someone that I have heard speak before, a local author. So I was sent an advance copy of his book, and I could not put it down. Then I had a meeting with this gentleman, and he was just a delight, and so our first speaker was booked. His first book, A Simplified Map of the Real World, and he is going to read from one of the chapters this evening, and I've got to get this straight. I don't want to make any mistakes. Okay, you ready? The Idiot's Guide to Intuitive Mastery of Newtonian Physics. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Stevan Allred.
This is a big treat for me to be here with all of you to inaugurate this culture series here in Gresham. I'm very excited about that, and I'm very excited to be here in this building, this beautiful room. I'm sure most of you know this is an old Carnegie library, and it's 100 years old this year. And just September 7th, I spoke at the centennial celebration for the Estacada Library. And in the course of doing that, I did some research on Carnegie. And one of the things I learned is that he viewed these libraries not just as libraries, not just as a place you could go and get a book to check out, but he really saw them as community centers. Of course, Carnegie was a big steel man and had steel mills and all that kind of stuff. And his flagship library, which was in Pennsylvania Milltown, where he had a huge mill, it wasn't just a library. They had a bowling alley. They had a theater. They had all kinds of stuff. It was a whole series of buildings and like a campus, a community campus. And he really viewed the library as a way of building community. So here we are 100 years later. This is no longer the Gresham Library, but it's moved on probably because they needed more space. But wisely, the town has kept this building in use. It's this lovely museum now. And what I find especially fitting about all of this is here I am wired up for community media. So 100 years later, we're still building community in this community building. And that's really a great thing. So I'm very pleased to have been invited here and grateful. So in a minute, I'm going to read this story, the Idiot's Guide to Intuitive Mastery of Newtonian Physics. It takes about a half hour to read. And then we'll have time for some questions and answers, and I can sign books after we're all done with all of that. How many of you are writers? Several of you. Good. Okay. And are you interested in how this book got published? Sometimes people want to know that kind of story. Okay. So I started writing these stories about 10 years ago, and I fairly early on, a couple stories in, realized that maybe I could build a collection out of I sort of saw a glimmer with the second story in that I thought I could, there's something to do here. And what I wanted to do right away was link these stories together. So this is called a linked short story collection. And what that means is that the stories are linked together by setting. They all take place in and around the town of Renata. Renata is an imagined town. It's a very Pacific Northwest kind of a town. Its physical geography maps pretty closely to Estacada. I live outside of Estacada. But you wouldn't want to follow the driving instructions in the book very carefully because I have taken liberties from time to time. And if you do try to follow those directions, you're going to wind up in the ditch, as one of my characters does in a story. I wanted a little bit of leeway to imagine the kind of town, to give my imagination a place to play. So I did little things to change it, like changing the name of the town. Just so I could make it a little bit more mine and be freed up from the need to reproduce the reality in front of me too exactly. So I worked on the stories for a number of years, and sometimes one story would lead to the next one, sometimes not. Sometimes I'd not know what the next story was for a month or two, and then it would come to me. Writing a short story for me is usually about a 2-month process. I think of it as kind of a snapshot of what's going on in my life then, but they're not autobiographical in any very linear or literal way. They tend to start from random things out in the world that I observe, and then I've got language floating around in my head that sort of leads me into the story. How can I connect this strange, odd, funny thing I've seen out in the world with a phrase that's caught my imagination in some way? And for about 6 weeks, I feel like I'm beating my head against the wall because it just doesn't seem like it's ever going to work. The funny thing about short stories is you finish one, and when you finish it, you've figured out how to write that short story, and then you turn around to the next one, and that knowledge doesn't do you any good at all. Because now you've got a blank page in front of you, and the next short story needs some completely different solution to it. So another 6 weeks of beating my head against the wall, and then the last 2 weeks things start to fall into place, and that's the fun part. I've learned over the years not to worry about the head beating too much. It's just part of the process. It doesn't hurt anymore.
You don't have the hair.
Yeah, well, I have a callus right here. It's really thick. So I got the stories together, and then I just did nothing with them for a couple of years. I kept thinking I need to go back through this collection and just one more time kind of fine-tune it, put it all together. And I put that off for about 3 years, I think. And then I saw this opportunity to work with Forest Avenue Press with Laura Stanfill, who's back there in the red, and called her up. She was looking for novels. I didn't have a novel, but I had this kind of hybrid thing, these linked short stories. So this collection, each story stands on its own. 10 of them have been published as standalone stories, 10 out of the 15. And it doesn't have an overarching plot like a novel does that leads you all the way through. But what it does do that's like a novel is it gives you this very big, broad, round, longitudinal look at one place, this town of Renata that I've imagined. And so there's stories that are set 100 years ago. There's a story set in the early, this story that I'm about to read to you is set in, I think, 1972. And then most of the stories are more contemporary, 90s, the aughts. So you get to see the town, and you get to see certain families over time. And in that sense, it's novel-like, I think we could say. It gives you a different reading experience than you would have from just a collection of random stories. So I called Laura up. She said, yeah, I'll take a look at it. She got back to me in a week, which is unheard of in publishing. With this, I opened up this email from her that said, I can't remember the exact phrase, but I could picture Laura jumping up and down, screaming, I want to publish your book. please. And it was just one of the best things that's ever happened to me. And pretty much everything that's happened since in connection with this book has just been a joy. And I've just had a lot of fun. And it just seems to keep drawing good things out of the world, and they come at me, and it gives me a chance to turn them around and send them back to you guys. So that's what it's been like for me. That's where I'm coming from. And that's enough of me nattering on here. I'm going to read you a story. So here I am. This is our living room. And just imagine your kids again, and Dad's going to read you a story. Now he's going to read you a story that has a little bit of language in it, but you kids are old enough to hear this language, okay? And I'll be happy to take questions afterwards. So one thing about this book is that it's illustrated, which is very unusual for a short story collection. It's very unusual for adult fiction in general. There are signs that illustration is creeping back into adult fiction in small ways, and I love these drawings. I love illustrations in general. So the illustration for this particular story, this is small, you can't hardly see it, but this is a stick of dynamite, and the fuse is lit. Okay, so just carry that with you, and you'll see when it drops into the story. So here we go. The Idiot's Guide to Intuitive Mastery of Newtonian Physics. Jimmy and Todd bought the car cheap from Stubby Toobin. They thought they were looking for an old Willis Jeep, and that led them to Stubby, a tree topper who was old enough to know what logging was before there were bulldozers and chainsaws. There were plenty of used-up, flat-topped loggers hanging around in the bars till closing time sent them home to their tin-patch shacks, old skookum sucker punchers, minus a finger or two, who wouldn't let that stop them from throwing a punch if a brawl broke out. But everybody knew the story that made Stubby special. Stubby had once been 100 feet up an old-growth Doug fir he was rigging to be a spar tree for a clear cut. He had the high lead rigged to the mainline block when a sharp tug from the donkey engine cracked the tree right through the rot hidden at the base, butt rot that Stubby should have known was there, but had somehow missed. He was tied to the trunk with his flip line, so that as the tree fell, twisting through the air, he had to keep jumping his feet around it to stay on top. He rode that tree clear to the ground, where it bounced 4 times, twisting each time with him underneath it or on top of it, flailing him around on his flip line like one of those paddle balls kids play with. And each time he was underneath, it was his good fortune. There was a swale where he landed, so he was not crushed. It was Stubby who talked Jimmy and Todd through the knit and the grit of what they wanted to do and how to survive it without breaking every bone in Todd's young body. What they came to in Stubby's cabin over a pot of coffee with bourbon bumps just to keep it interesting was that Todd's chances would improve to well above those of a back alley crapshoot if he rode on top of the launch vehicle rather than in it. And to do that, they would have to make some serious modifications. They needed something with an automatic transmission, not some old Willis Jeep with a manual, and Stubby had just the thing sitting in his yard, along with all the other rusty hulks he'd accumulated over a lifetime of infatuation with what a man could do if he had the right machine and a brawny set of balls. 1960 Plymouth Valiant with a Power Flight transmission, Stubby said. Ever seen one? You shift gears by pushing those buttons right there on the dashboard. Todd and Jimmy, intuitive Newtonians and fledgling jump-happy jalopy drivers, knew right then that this was the car. Do you think, Todd said, this would fly better if we put some weight in the trunk to balance out the weight of the engine? Nods all around. They were out to make their place in the history of crazy bone crunch stunts. They called the car Dwayne because they bought it the day Dwayne Allman died. They sat, the 3 of them, Todd, Jimmy, and Mike Volpe, in aluminum lawn chairs in front of the single-wide that Todd rented on the edge of Adelaide Hamby's place. Volpe had shown up unannounced on a Sunday afternoon with a case of beer and what he called a little proposition. Jimmy was there because he was always there that summer, the summer of 1972, when Jimmy and Todd both worked swing shift at the mill, and Todd was still on probation. They were 3 beers in and had most of the details settled. The where and the when, the pills, half up front and half on delivery, the cliff, and how the loggers would site prep it for the jump, when the true nature of Volp's proposition came to light. "Hey," he said, "I've just had this crazy idea. What do you say we charge people to watch?" Jimmy and Todd both raised their beer bottles and drank, staring messages at each other. Danger from Jimmy to Todd, opportunity from Todd to Jimmy. "How much you thinking?" Todd asked. "To see somebody jump a car off a cliff and land in a lake?" Volp leaned into the space between them. He put his hand out, palm up, as if the gesture alone were enough to make money appear. "I think we can get $20 a head, and I bet I can round up 50 people. Todd, the balls in the brains and balls combo that was Jimmy and Todd, said, "Nice chunk of change." He took a swig off his beer. "What is that, Jimmy? $1,000? Jimmy nodded, but he was watching Volp, waiting for him to turn his head and give the blue-eyed stare he'd used to close the deal with Todd so many times before. Volp was a couple years older than Todd. He was as slick as warm bacon grease, and he'd made a career out of taking advantage of Todd's weakness for any kind of a buzz. "What do you want out of this?" Jimmy asked. There it was, eyes the color of a work shirt for an honest day's work, and a smile that asked them to believe that they were all in this together. "We split it 50-50, Volp said. Half to you guys for putting on the show, and half to me for finding all that money." Todd's head bobbed back and forth as if his brain were scales balancing 2 things of almost equal weight. They'd gone from nothing to $500 in a heartbeat, but Jimmy didn't like it. Jimmy didn't like much of anything about Volp, but Volp had the pills, and Todd wanted the pills, and his brother wanting the pills was Volp's thumb on the scales. Jimmy shook his head no. What a weasel Mike Volp was, always had been. He'd always been a little scared of Mike. Mike was a big guy and a bit of a bully, but he wasn't nearly as scared as he would be if Todd weren't there. And he had to say something before Todd blew it and accepted. "We're not stupid," Jimmy said. "First off, there's 3 of us here, and second, we don't need you to sell tickets for us." He was an idiot for not seeing it himself. Of course they could charge people to watch. They'd been so involved in getting the car ready to go, or he might have realized. "I'm a reasonable guy," Volp said. "I could go thirds on the money." The 2 of them stood up, Jimmy and Todd, Todd's hands in loose fists, just in case. That was the good thing about Todd. He would back you up without bothering to wonder whether or not he thought you were right. Volp sat in his chair and pulled a pair of sunglasses out of his shirt pocket. He put them on and stared up at the 2 brothers, and then he stood up, a head taller than either one of them. "We'll think about it," Jimmy said. Todd picked up the case of beer and handed it to Volp. "I still want those pills," he said. Volp smirked the smirk that made people want to punch him. "No deal on the pills," he said, "until we cut a deal on the money." He took his beer and walked over to his car, a red El Camino he kept shiny because he figured women liked guys with shiny cars. "I brought you guys the spot. That's got to be worth something." "I said we'd think about it," said Jimmy. After Volp pulled away, Todd said, $300 and change apiece? Why didn't you say yes?" Jimmy walked over to their jump car, Dwayne. The push buttons were the key to the whole thing. Todd might be crazy enough to jump a car into a lake, but he wasn't looking to die doing it. They'd poured 300 pounds of cement into the footwells behind the front seat to balance out the weight of the engine, so Dwayne would fly level until he hit the water. The greater the mass, Todd liked to say, the bigger the splash. They'd cut the roof off the car with a welding torch, removed the windows and the windshield, covered the back seat area with a piece of 1-inch plywood mounted to the body, and screwed an aluminum lawn chair to the plywood deck. All that so Todd wouldn't get his body tangled up with the steering wheel when he hit the water. They'd rigged up a throttle cable and hooked 2 steel cables to the steering wheel. All Todd had to do was put the car in drive with a broomstick on the push button, gun the throttle, and keep equal tension on the cables like a water skier behind a boat. The car would go balls out and straight ahead until it was airborne, and after that, Todd could sit back and enjoy the ride. He's a weasel, Jimmy said. You can't trust him. Larrabee's personal idjit meter had gone from twitchy all the way to flippy-floppy by the time the dog days of August rolled around. He knew something was up from the way idjits stared right through him with no more regard than they would give a cardboard cutout. That they were working too hard on keeping their cool showed in the careful construction of their supreme nonchalance. A man with nothing to hide had eyes that saw a man with a badge and moved on to the next thing. But an idjit with a secret can't deprive himself of the pleasure of making a big show of his own fabricated innocence. But Larrabee could take no action on the basis of how his idjit meter was acting up. He needed facts, the who, what, where, and when of the criminal act, and facts were exactly what he did not have. This was the normal condition of the rural law enforcement officer who sprang to action in the vast majority of cases pretty much after the fact. Most of what Larrabee did in the way of investigative law enforcement consisted of waiting for some idjit to fall into his lap. So he sat in his cruiser in the various patches of shade that were his roadside lairs, and he sipped his coffee, and he waited. So it was that Larrabee happened to be under the shade of a 300-year-old white oak when Mike Volpe came tearing down Gossard Road in his red El Camino. The Gossards had complained to him for weeks about Volpe doing this very thing, driving 60 miles an hour on a gravel road where children played and dogs sunned themselves, raising a rooster tail of dust that hung in the still August air like a murderer's whispered confession. He'd come over the rise so fast that he was just hitting his brakes when he passed the cruiser, dumb enough to have gotten caught, but smart enough to pull right over the very second that Larrabee hit the siren. There would be no high-speed chase today, and there was a note of disappointment in the way the overamped purr of the siren trailed away to nothing. Larrabee pulled up behind Volpe's El Camino and got out, and he saw how Volpe was watching him in his side view mirror, so he made sure that Volpe saw him unsnap the safety strap on his holster. 11 years as a deputy, and he'd never fired his weapon in the line of duty, but he found it useful to bring to an idjit's early attention that he could fire it if he chose to do so. "Afternoon, deputy," Volpe said. He smiled up at Larrabee, the insufferable smile of someone who relies on his father being the richest merchant in town and a known contributor to the political campaigns of Larrabee's boss, Sheriff Winnemore, in order to get himself out of a scrape. "Afternoon, Volpe. Could I have your license and registration, please?" "Yes, sir, Deputy Larrabee." Larrabee gave him a look that said, "Don't get smart with me, boy." But Volpe wasn't buying it. Not yet, anyway. His license and registration were current. Larrabee had him for the speeding, 60 and a 25, and on a gravel road, no less, which was enough to write him up for reckless driving. A 180 fine and a mandatory trip to driving school, probably good enough to get this particular idjit to slow down for a while. But Larrabee's idjit meter right then was twittering between flippy and floppy. So on the strength of that, he decided to roust Volpe to see if anything interesting would shake out. "I suppose you think I was going a little fast," Volpe said. His voice was crafty and composed, and wasn't he cute the way he said little with a long E and held his thumb and fingers close together to show how a little fast was. "Just a skosh," Larrabee said. "Would you mind stepping out of the car, please?" Volpe got out and leaned his back against the car, his hands jammed into the pockets of his jeans. He had a logger's broad suspenders on over a plaid flannel shirt with the sleeves cut off above his elbows. The crews hit the words before dawn in the summer and worked until the forestry regs said the day was too hot to risk a spark coming off one of their saws, which was a damn shame in Larrabee's considered opinion because it gave them that many more hours in which to drink. "Stand up straight, please." Volpe stood up. There was beer on his breath, but Larrabee didn't see any empties, at least not in plain view. Cross your feet. Now bend over and touch your toes. Volp complied with an indolence that was meant to infuriate. But when he bent over, 4 red and white capsules fell out of his shirt pocket and onto the ground in front of his feet. The toe of Larrabee's shoe covered them just ahead of Volp's reaching fingers. Volp looked up at Larrabee, and Larrabee let him see that he was resting his hand on the butt of his pistol. "Volp," Larrabee said, "Mike, old buddy, be a good fellow and step down to the front of the car and lean yourself over the hood with your arms spread wide." He had the idjit right where he wanted him now, and Volp knew it. He could tell by the way the smirk fell right off his face. It was laying there in the gravel underneath the toe of Larrabee's shoe. When Volp was leaned over the hood of his car, Larrabee bent down and picked up the pills. "Vitamins?" Larrabee said. "Antihistamines?" He held one of the capsules up between his thumb and finger. "I know they ain't Tylenol because Tylenol says Tylenol right on the pill." Volp had his cheek pressed tight to the hood of his car, but his eyes were on that pill in Larrabee's hand like it was the key to his entire future. "Nothing to say for yourself, Mikey?" "Well, no matter. The crime lab will tell us what kind of illicit possession to charge you with." He walked around behind Volp and got his handcuffs off his belt. "Put your hands behind your back." He cuffed him. Tight enough to feel them, tight enough that they would leave a welt if Volp struggled against them the least little bit. He grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him off the hood of the car. He said, "Stand up and face me." The capsules were in the palm of his hand where Volp could see them. "Here's the deal, Mikey. I can haul you in on suspicion and hold you until we find out what's in those pills, or you can tell me what the ding-dong is going on here. You and your skookum buddies are up to something, and I want to know what it is." Volp's eyes went from the pills to Larrabee's face and back again. He could detect no sign of a bluff on the sheriff's face. His old man was going to roll over him like a steamroller squashing a bug if he got hit with a drug charge. Those Jimmy and Todd, this was their fault. If they'd had the brains to accept his little proposition, he wouldn't have had those pills in his pocket just now. He was screwed, and there wasn't but one way out of this mess. And that was how Larrabee got the who and the what and the where and the when. The spot was a deep alpine lake on the edge of a clear cut well up one of the lesser tributaries to the Kalish. The lake was tucked into a cove between 2 ridges, and there was a basalt cliff maybe 40 feet high at one end. Below the lake was a war zone of slash piles and stumps, the ground scarified down to bare dirt. The loggers had bulldozed a dirt road from their clear cut on up to the basalt. It was nothing but an ungraveled bare dirt track, but the last 600 feet of it ran straight for the edge of the cliff. Larrabee could see all of this through his binoculars. He'd driven 20 miles on gravel roads to get to the spot from the backside of the ridge above, so they wouldn't see him coming. He parked his car alongside the road and hiked up to the top of the ridge. A bunch of men were milling around below, some of them with beers in their hands. A few women, too, girlfriends most likely. He picked out Todd Allquist, who was leaning against the side of their tricked-up car next to Stubby Tubin. Dwayne was spray-painted on the lid to the trunk in big, black, drippy letters. Jimmy Allquist was working his way through the crowd with a clipboard, and people were handing him money. There was probably a law against that. There were laws against damn near everything these days, but actual criminals were rare in Renata, and dangerous sociopaths were even rarer. What you had a lot of was some very independent-minded people who were used to doing pretty much what they damn well pleased. It was his job to decide who to let off with a warning and who to lock up. Some days he felt like Solomon himself, and other days he was just another head of a deputy sheriff making it up as he went along. He had this jump business sized up as a public safety issue. If there was a crime here, It was a crime without a victim. Nobody had put a gun to Todd Alquist's head and told him he had to jump a car into a lake. No doubt the boy had caught the fever when he ran that John Deere tractor into the river the year before. He was probably still on probation for that damn fool stunt, so there was probably a violation in that too. But it wasn't the kind of violation that got Larrabee's hackles up. The truth was, the night he'd chased Todd Alquist through town had been as much fun as anything he'd ever done as a deputy sheriff. No two ways about it. A balls-to-the-wall, flat-out high-speed chase was the best part of the job. Larrabee's patrol car was a Ford Fairlane, a police cruiser with a 429 V8 under the hood and a beefed-up suspension. She would do 140 on a straightaway, and who the hell did those idiots think they were, trying to outrun him on a tractor? He'd caught sight of the John Deere just as it crossed the highway, rear tires as tall as the roof of his cruiser. The cruiser gulped the distance between them like a greedy dog, but before he caught all the way up, the tractor jumped the curb and ran full tilt boogie between two Doug firs on the bluff above the river. Larrabee skidded to a stop. He threw his door open and jumped out in time to see the top of what must have been one hell of a splash. The frothy white flash of water flying straight up until gravity pulled it straight back down. By the time he got to the edge of the bluff, the tractor had sunk. But in the moonlight, he could see the roiled water around a large glassy oval and Todd swimming hard for the other side. Damn, what a ride. Fellow would have to be crazy to think you could make a tractor fly, but it was the kind of crazy Larrabee admired for the sheer balls of it. To live your life like you were a lit stick of dynamite tossed high into the air, and never mind what comes when the fuse burns all the way down. The only question now was Todd in danger of doing himself any harm? Larrabee was going to look like a real idiot if something bad happened to the boy, so why he was contemplating risking his career to see the boy make the jump into the lake, he was only just now ready to admit to himself. There was a little bit of idiot in everybody, even him. He watched Todd climb up into the seat they'd rigged up for jumping the car. So be it. There was no way he could get down there fast enough to stop him now. Everybody moved over to the edge of the cliff, lining up on both sides of where the car would leap off. Everybody except Jimmy, who hopped on a little dirt bike and raced on down to the lake. He had a big coil of rope draped over his shoulder. He must be the safety crew, ready to help out if Todd needed it after he hit the water. The jump car started moving. It picked up speed fast. It looked like Todd was steering it with magic, his two hands out in front of him but several feet from the steering wheel. The car bounced along on the rough road. Todd leaned back like a bull rider, and now Larrabee caught the sun flashing off the cables that connected his hands to the steering wheel. 300 feet to go, and the car was doing maybe 30, then 40 with 100 feet to go, maybe 45 as the tires left the cliff behind. A collective shout came from the crowd, which had been silent until then. The car sailed out over the lake, flying level and true, with Todd yelling a rebel's yell into the alpine air. The car fell through the air for as long as it takes to fall into grace. And Larrabee, not ordinarily a religious man, offered up, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," all he could remember of the 23rd Psalm, and he held his breath and watched it fall. The car pancaked, sending a great sheet of water blasting straight up that hid Todd as if behind a curtain. Cheers from the crowd on the cliff. The curtain of water fell back to the surface of the lake, and there was Todd, flat on his butt, with the lawn chair collapsed beneath him. The car sank fast, there being so little air trapped in it to keep it afloat. Todd stayed still until the water reached his chest, and then he slapped the lake with his arms and started swimming. Jimmy threw the rope out to him, but Todd was making for the shore already. The cheering went on, and Larrabee was laughing and clapping his hands together. He didn't give a rip what the law said about what had just happened here. If a man couldn't raise his middle finger and shake it in the face of gravity every once in a while, well, then there wasn't much point to being alive. Down below the clear cut, he saw dust rising behind a red car, coming fast up the road to the cliff. A red El Camino, and why in the hell was that idiot Volpe showing up here now? Larrabee hurried down the backside of the ridge to where his car was parked. The last thing he wanted was for a fight to break out. Todd came out of the water so chilled he should have been shaking like a wet dog, but he was so high on adrenaline, he didn't feel the cold any more than he felt the ache he would feel later where his butt hit the plywood when the lawn chair collapsed. Jimmy was waiting for him with his arms open and the beatific smile of someone whose every intuition about the laws of Newtonian physics has just been confirmed in the risky crucible of crap-shooting experience. "We did it, bro," Jimmy yelled, and he wrapped his arms around Todd and lifted him clean off the ground, swinging him in a high arc before he set him back down again. They stood shoulder to shoulder and faced the people cheering at them from on top of the cliff, and they each of them raised a triumphant arm which drew even more cheers. They were crackerjack wild men now. They were certified, the newest members of a club you could only join by doing something skillful and reckless and potentially fatal, like Stubby Toobin had done. "Free pitchers at the Ripsaw," Todd said. "I won't have to pay for a beer for months." They looked at each other then, sobered by the mention of time. Todd had gotten his draft notice the week before, and he didn't have months. In less than 30 days, he had to report for his physical. Jimmy leaned his forehead against Todd's forehead. He wasn't old enough to even set foot inside the Ripsaw, let alone have somebody buy him a beer there. Todd would likely be in Vietnam when he turned 21, when they should be here, celebrating together like they were now. "When you get back," Jimmy said, "the pictures are on me." Todd had no room inside himself for this. "Shut up," he said. "Don't even talk like that." He wanted to get high. He wanted to wipe out any trace of the future bearing down on him. He wanted his whole life to be exactly like it was right now. "This is the best goddamn day of my life," Todd said. "Let's go get drunk." There was some kind of commotion up on the cliff, the crowd splitting open and a county sheriff's car arriving in the gap. The door opened, and they both saw how it was. "Christ," Todd said. "What the hell is he doing here?" "Larrabee," Jimmy said. "Let's go see what he wants." Volpe got out of his car with a fat book in his hands, the kind of book that government regulators kept their regulations in. He was damn sure going to see it that those Allquist boys were not the beneficiaries of the kind of deal Larrabee had cut with him. They were trash, those boys. They were the runts of the litter, and they didn't deserve any leniency because they would never amount to anything. He marched right up to Larrabee and said, "Where are they? I want those arrested." He flopped the book open on the hood of Larrabee's patrol car. "Look here," he said, and he jabbed his finger at some persnickety paragraph that said it was a Class C misdemeanor to abandon a vehicle in the National Forest. Larrabee was willing to bet there was a phone call from Volpe's father to the head ranger behind that book being in his hands. "That's a funny position for you to take," he said, "given your own selective idea of which laws you would like to obey in your own personal life." Jimmy and Todd rode up on the dirt bike from the lake. Everyone was crowded around the sheriff and Volpe, but they parted to let the Allquist boys through. Todd was dripping wet and grinning, and Jimmy had the look of someone who has just found a way to cheat St. Peter at cards and get away with it. "Them," Volpe said. "I want you to arrest them." Todd and Jimmy went wide-eyed and shrug-shouldered, the very picture of, "Who, us? We ain't done nothing wrong." Volpe's fists were balled up, and he took a step toward them, but the whole crowd took a step forward, ready to stop him. He worked as hard as any man in the woods, and for that he was due some respect. But the bottom line was, his daddy was the richest merchant in town, and Volpe logging was Volpe slumming. And that book full of Forest Service regs was all the proof they needed that Volpe was never really one of them. Larrabee held up his hands. The crowd fell silent. "I can't arrest him," Larrabee said, "unless you sign a complaint." "No problem," Volpe said. "Show me where to sign." Jimmy Allquist said, "What the hell do you mean, sign a complaint?" He looked around at the men in the crowd, men who made their living dropping trees the way they knew how, men who hated regulation of any kind. "The National Forest belongs to everybody," Jimmy said. "Am I right?" "Damn straight," Todd said. "We got as much right to drive a car off a cliff as anybody." Volp's weasel of a face put on a scowlish threat, but there were nods of agreement from all around, except from Larrabee, who looked over at that book of regulations on the hood of his car and cussed the paperwork this was going to force him to do. The thing of it was, if he couldn't talk Volp out of signing a complaint, he would have to act or face a suspension if he didn't. Stubby Toobin stepped through from the back of the crowd. He got right up in Volp's face, and he looked up at Volp, more than a foot taller than he was, and he winked at him. Then he punched him hard in the gut, doubling him up and bringing his face down within easy reach. Stubby looked over at Larrabee, who simply looked back at him. He didn't say yes, and he didn't say no, and that was all the permission Stubby needed. One more punch to Volp's jaw dropped him clean. Volp was face down, one hand underneath him and one hand palm down on the dirt. His right hand, most likely the hand he wrote with. Stubby stomped down on it with the heel of his boot, and everybody heard the bones crack. Larrabee leaned over and felt for a pulse on Volp's neck. Still a beating heart. The way he figured it, the absence of any fatal injuries made today a pretty successful day. "Well," said Stubby, "I guess he's changed his mind about signing a complaint." "Nope," Larrabee said, "nobody's got any complaints here, near as I can tell. I didn't see nothing, and nobody else saw nothing, and that's all she wrote. Everybody got that?" Nods all around. It was as fine a summer's day as anyone could hope for. Below them, the lake sparkled. The mountain air was soft and clean with the scent of the firs, and the sun shone bright on the roof of Larrabee's patrol car. They all four of them stared at the car, Larrabee, Stubby, Jimmy, and Todd, and they all four of them, if they only knew it, were thinking the exact same thing. Just how far would that car jump? Thank you. So, questions, comments, anything?
We've got a mic here, so we're looking
Yeah.
for questions. Yes.
Hi.
This is Charles Juneman, who I just met tonight, but Charles used to be the principal at the middle school in Estacada.
I worked there for about 7 years, and
Yeah.
I received an advance copy, thankfully, and
Yeah.
and I was taken by your characters, and I could swear that I recognized some of them.
Uh-huh.
But then I started questioning myself. Did I recognize them from my own hometown of Yamhill, Oregon?
Yeah.
And so my question is, from a reader's perspective, when you see a character that you think you recognize,
Yeah.
what is the writer doing? Have you run across characters that you have put into this book, or have you run across just a collection of behaviors, and you've taken an arm here and an ear here and
Yeah.
and a situation here and blended them together? Is it both? Is it one or the other? What happens when you created these characters?
Yeah, great question. So from a reader's perspective, that's how you phrased it. What I want you to have happen is exactly what you have happening. I want you to see your friends, your neighbors, people you've known over the course of your life, maybe even yourself in these characters. How I actually create them is very much the opposite of that. So from my side of the page, I think of myself as a character actor. So in this book, there are, I believe, 36 or maybe 37 characters who have at least a scene. And that's 36 or 37 different versions of me. So I'm the 8-year-old boy in the title story. I'm the 91-year-old woman who speaks to us in a different story. And I'm everybody in between. I'm drawing on certainly my own experiences and who I am. But what I'm decidedly not doing is doing what a portrait artist would do, which is, have someone sit for them or work from a photograph or work from the real world to the canvas. I'm really working from inside to the page. But then what happens after that, once these stories go out in the world, they don't belong to me anymore. They belong to you, all of you. And so, what you see in them, what you experience, That's what matters after that. And my opinion about what a character is all about is no more important than yours. It's, once you give it away, it's for readers. That's part of the pleasure of it, is to make this thing and then just give it away and let you guys have an experience with it. That's really a huge piece of why I do this. Yeah, good question.
Awesome. Okay.
So that was a fascinating story, Stevan.
Thank
you. Do you start out with an idea and a theme for a story, and then as you begin to put those characters together, does that sometimes change the direction that the story goes as these characters begin to take really a life of their own?
The story takes on a life of its own. And at the beginning, I don't have a plan. I just have a feeling. I'll tell you, the opening story is called His Ticky Little Mind. So that story, the way it started, I was between stories, so I have this kind of empty space inside me. And I've learned to just, in those moments of my life, to just listen to myself, to what's going on up here. I probably had some little piece of language that was bouncing around up there that I was interested in. I left my house with my family one morning to drive into Portland. A couple miles from home, we passed a house that had a very large, I think that was a Doug fir, a very large, beautiful old tree in the front yard. And they had cut it down, and they'd left a stump 12 feet high, which I thought was really weird. And just as I passed that house with that tree cut down 12 feet high, the oncoming traffic was a pickup truck, and on the side of the truck was a little business sign, and it said Volp on it. And that was all it went by so fast, that was all I saw. So I had Volp, I had this 12-foot tall stump, and I had some little bit of language in my head. That's how they start. Now Volp, it turns out he's in about 4 of these stories. I mean, there was something about that name that really tickled me. And the character that grew out of that first story turned out to be really useful to me, and you see how he turns up in this story as a young man. I've learned that whatever ideas I might have about what I want the story to be when I start, or as I'm in the early drafting of it, that at a certain point when the story achieves a kind of critical mass, it's about what the story wants. And it's one of the things I've learned to do is to not attach too much. If I want the story to go this way and the story wants to go that way, it's a lot faster to let go of this and just follow the story. The story will lead me to where it wants to be. Because stories are, they're ancient. They're really, really old. There aren't that many of them. And, there are these kind of archetypal structures that I think we carry them around inside of us. And so when you tell someone a story, it's like you're activating that archetype inside of them more than you're telling them something they don't already know. It's just, your way of telling it is going to be your own. But the underlying story is going to be some old story. I'm thinking now, what's the old story behind this one? This is a story about brothers. That's, I think, what's at the core of it. Brothers who are, they're bound together. But there's another story about these two brothers. We get, later in the collection, you get the story of the tractor going into the river. And that's a much darker story. Todd's a really pretty flawed character. And it's, to me, that what's underneath all of this is these two brothers and how they are in the world and how one of them is going to prosper and one of them is not.
Awesome. Any other questions?
Scott, right here.
I was really impressed with he sort of caught, the flavor of the language in 40 years ago, 72. It seemed, it took me back because I hadn't heard that, I swear, for 40 years. Anyway, so do you use historical? How do you get the sense of using the vernacular of that era, especially that kind of logging sense of skookum?
Yeah. Well, I pay attention to language all the time. I'm a word nerd of the first order. And I'm always, anything that I hear out in the world that catches my ear, I kind of file it away. All of that logging language that's research. That's not language that I knew, but it's not that hard to get at. Skookum, I ran across that. I probably, one of the sources for this story is there's a Stuart Holbrook book. Does people know who Stuart Holbrook was? He was an amazing Oregonian writer. I think he had a newspaper column. It might have been for the Oregon Journal back when there was an Oregon Journal. But he had a column, and what he wrote about were characters. And we're talking all the way back to the early 1900s. And he would go out to the logging camps and meet guys, or he'd go down to the bars and drink beer with them. And he just collected stories and characters and wrote them up. And I know some of that language and some of that flavor I got from looking at his stuff. And I'm sure that's where I ran across the word skookum, which I had heard before, but I just, that's just a great word. I just wanted to find a way to use it,
I guess it's Chinook.
Yeah, right.
Good,
it's a native word.
Having worked in the woods a few years, just the whole cadence of that kind of.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's pretty particular, I think, to whatever a little bit removed from today.
Yes.
It is diesel, and things are much more metrics, and it's changed. So it was nice to feel that.
Yeah.
It really captured that kind of push button transmission.
Yeah.
That's the real deal.
Yeah, that's a real car. My brother had that car.
Thank you. Could you pass that back?
Okay.
Okay. Richard?
I think we got a question right here.
Well, I've got one right here.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Here we go.
kind of just follows up. I was just interested in how you connected the technology of this story, a Mopar push button and a broomstick, with where did you decide that's what's got to go?
I just made all that up.
Very
Kids,
good.
don't try this at home. I have no idea if you could actually do this the way they've done it. I have no real world experience. I kind of wanted it to sound like a Rube Goldberg, contraption, because I think I hope there's a sense of, man, these guys could die doing this. This is stupid what they're doing. It's crazy, it's reckless, it's fun, but it's not very bright.
Rural Oregon.
It's rural Oregon. You bet it is, Becky. Yeah.
We do a lot of that in here. Here you go, Becky.
I've heard most of the stories out of your collection, and when you've read them in groups before, one of the things that the women always say is, how does he write like a woman?
Uh-huh.
Because most men don't listen, so they wouldn't have the perspective.
Yeah.
And now I know you have one where it's a wife of someone.
Yeah.
And then there's the goat lady.
Right.
How many of your main characters, from their perspective, that are telling the story, are female?
There's at least a half a dozen. I'm looking at Laura back here. She knows this manuscript as well as I do. I can think of 5 or 6. I really enjoy doing the female characters a lot, and I like the challenge of it. I'm extremely flattered by the response I've gotten from you and others up at Becky and I are in this artist salon up in Sandy, the Artist's Edge. And it's very gratifying for me to hear from women that the female characters work as well as they do. And it's just, you just pay attention. You just listen.
One of the things that we really enjoy about your collection is some of them are dark. Some of them are like this one, on the lighter side.
Yeah.
The range of emotions and marital situations and just life situations. It's like a schizophrenic wrote the book, It's Sybil, because there's so much personality and so many of them. Anyway, love your book.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Hi.
I was just hello. I'm a writer myself, and I was wondering how you manage the scheduling of your writing. Some writers I know will have certain hours and they don't go outside of that. I myself will wake up in the middle of the night
Yeah.
and, the thought's there and I know it will be gone if I don't put it on the page.
Yeah.
And do you work outside? I mean, another job? Or
I have a day job, yeah.
Yeah, what do you do? I'm just
I'm a
curious.
property manager. Yeah, good way to meet interesting people. I like to write early in the morning. I wake up pretty early, and I like to get right to it. 4:30, 5:30, 6:30, somewhere in there. I like to get at it before the real world comes crashing in with all of its demands and all of its distractions. Before I have to figure out, this guy's late on his rent. What am I going to do about that? I want to play in my imagination, and the best way for me to get that done is before my day really starts.
Wow, is there any other questions? That was just marvelous. Thank you so much, Stevan.
Thank you.
Wow, what a kickoff.
Yeah.
We have 4 more series coming. We're taking November and December off for the holidays, so you guys can all spend your time there. But tickets to these events is a very nice Christmas gift. Our January visitors and event will be our 2 poets from over in Corbett who are going to help you unpuzzle the world of poetry.
And let me just say, I know these guys. They're good. They're really, really amazing poets and really interesting people. They'll have, they'll really put on a great show for you.
So make sure all your friends know. We're already set up for next season. We've got 1 or 2 people already signed up. We'll be doing 2 next year, or 6 next year, I'm sorry, starting in September with Jane Kilpatrick. Yes, will be joining us. So it's going to be a series of different type of art medias. I hope you'll share it with everybody and have them come and enjoy us. In the meantime, there's some more food back there. Stevan will be over here with his books, signing those, and have a nice evening.